Okay, today we're going to talk about modernity and structuralism, and I'm going to talk about it longer than I normally would because the ideas are so important for themselves, but also for understanding what comes next in the term. I'm going to talk about modernism very briefly, mostly in terms of the Enlightenment. And when the Enlightenment occurred, it ushered in these new ideas that we take for granted now, like the fact that empiricism and observation can tell us things about the world, or that reason and rationality can tell us things about the world. We might say that in the Enlightenment is essentially allowing us to describe the world based on our own observations or reason instead of just listening to authority. And I'm going to talk about how that shows up primarily in structuralism, which tries to describe many things. Today I'm going to talk mostly about language, and mostly about Saussure's view of language. So before I do that, there are a couple of vocabulary words that I need to make sure we mention. One is the difference between langue and parole. Langue means language, parole means speech. The difference here is important because when you're learning a language, you're not just learning. Well, let me start the other way. You could learn a language by learning how to conjugate verbs and learning the vocabulary and learning differences between your native language and the language, the target language. Or you could just memorize a bunch of phrases and not know what the phrases are made up of in terms of words or verbs or anything like that, but just know what the phrases kind of mean. The first would be an example of learning the langue, learning the language. The second would be an example of learning the parole, learning the speech. The difference is that you can use examples of language when you speak, but that's different from knowing the language as a whole. So when I am speaking to you right now, that's an example of parole, an example of language, but my knowledge of English is a knowledge of langue, of English as a language. It's important, the distinction, for a couple of reasons. One is that structuralists want to understand the langue. They want to understand the language and rather how language or any structure works as a whole, and want to think not just about examples of it as they turn up, like examples of sentences that someone might say, but use those as examples to explain the entire structure. So if you gave me enough examples of parole, I might be able to figure out the langue. But if I understand the langue, I can give you an infinite number of examples of parole. All of which is to say, and this is a second, but maybe the first in different words, is that parole are examples of langue. Okay, and structuralists are interested in the langue. They're also interested in the difference between the diachronic and the synchronic. If you've taken a history of language course with me or with anyone, you learned that language changes over time. That's a diachronic description of language. You learn about how certain languages influence others. You learn about derivations of not derivations in linguistic sense, but how certain parts of languages are derived from other families, language families. And all of this is a really important aspect of linguistics. We talk about philology all the time, but the structuralists wanted to use not just the historical or diachronic aspects of language, but wanted to talk about the system, the structure of language, the larger way that language worked. And that was a synchronic analysis. Synchronic means across time, wherever there's language, it works like this. Diachronic means I'm going to show you how language works in different examples at different moments of time. So similar to Langue and parole, they're not even remotely synonymous, but parole gives us some examples, but Langue is the structure that structuralists are interested in. Diachronic gives us the history, but synchronic gives us this larger picture that structuralists are interested in. So Saussure decided that he was going to talk about Langue, and he was going to talk about it synchronically. And this in and of itself was quite surprising or shocking, just in that he was doing linguistics really differently than other people had done it before. I'm going to show you some pictures of how he described language in a structuralist Enlightenment way. And the pictures that I'm going to show you are from the light board that I got that I was hoping to use all through the term for class, but I can't use it because it turns out that there's too much glare. But I can draw pictures and take photographs of them at night and then upload them and show them to you right now. And that's way less exciting, but still pretty cool. By the end of the week, I'm going to have a boring chalkboard that I can use. We'll have to revert to something much less interesting. But for right now, I'm going to show you the light board pictures and talk you through them. I love Saussure, and he's very important now, even though he's sort of old-fashioned philosophically. A lot of what he has said is still used all the time. And I can't find the button for showing you the screen. Oh, look, here it is under share screen. All right, here are the pictures that I drew with my light board. A light board is, I'm sure you know, and here you can see, but you draw on it with markers and it lights up from behind, but it's got shiny plastic. So whenever I hold it up to the camera or the computer, it shows you like Inception-y, the computer. Okay, so Saussure stops using the word word. Instead, he starts talking about the sign. Because words, he says, are made up of two parts. It's not just the word, like you would say cat is a word, but it also comes along with an idea of what the word means. So here, there's the quote unquote word for cat, and then there's the idea of a cat. You'll see here I don't know how to draw. It will become increasingly obvious that I don't know how to draw, and I just need you to go with it. You don't have to not laugh, but just pretend that what I tell you looks like a cat actually looks like a cat. That's all I need. Okay, so a sign has two parts. It has the part that is the letters or the sound, C-A-T or cat when I say it. And then it has the concept of the cat. So when you say it or I read it, I immediately think of this thing that I think of as cat, which is to say that the concept is evoked by the letters or the sounds. Similarly, if I think of a cat, I immediately associate it with the letters or the sounds. That, according to Saussure, is the way we should think about words. So he says signs, we're going to say signs from now on. Okay, there are a couple of things that happen here when we start talking about signs. First, and down here, you're just going to have to bear with me because this showed up badly. See, you can see the glare down here. Unfortunately, I'm just going to have to start playing with the light board myself in my free time. Okay, if you want to talk about an actual cat, like my erstwhile cat Lucy, then you call her the referent. So this up here isn't Lucy, isn't an actual cat. It's my idea of the cat. This down here is the actual cat, Lucy, who's the referent. So the sign refers to an actual cat. And if you saw Lucy walk into a room, both of these would be invoked. The sign would be invoked. And you would say, look, there's a cat. Similarly, if someone said, look, there's a cat, both of these would be invoked, and you would look around and find Lucy. Lucy won't walk in anymore because she's dead, which is a long story with a happy ending. Okay, the other thing on here is signification. The relationship between these two things right here is called signification. There's no compelling reason for you to memorize that term, except that when it comes up, when he mentions signification, you need to know that he's talking about the way these two things connect to each other. That this signifies this, and this signifies this, and signification is what keeps these two together as part of the sign. Okay. Now, these two things together, part of the sign, are described in two different ways. The top is called the signified, and the bottom is called the signifier. I mentioned in the notes, which maybe you saw for the Bressler reading, that I'm using the signified and signifier opposite of the way he does. So he puts signified on the bottom and signifier on the top. So Sewer and everyone else does it this way. So if you're taking notes on the Bressler, you might want to swap them out, swap them so that signified goes on the top. Okay, when he talks about cat down here, what he means is the letters cat and the sound of the letters cat, C-A-T, and cat. The image is what they look like. The sound is what they sound like. So he says sound image right here. And he talks about the sound image, he calls it the signifier. And we're going to call it the signifier. The signifier is the sound image of the sign, of what used to be called the word. Most people used to, before Saussure, think of word as describing just the sound image, as being just the signifier that pointed to the referent. Saussure is saying, no, the signifier and the signified combine to make a sign that points to the referent. It's not just the sound image, it's also this concept that gets evoked when you hear the sound or you see the letters. And that concept is the signified. It's the thing that the signifier makes you think of. Okay, you have to understand this. So if you don't, write down all your questions about it and ask me during class. You have to understand that a sign is made up of a signifier and a signified, and that the signifier is the sound image, and that the signified is the concept. That we're using sign instead of word, and that the referent is some other thing out in the world that doesn't occur within the sign, but that the sign might point to. Okay. When you look at language this way, you can see this is exactly the same picture, except it's tilted, that he's doing a synchronic analysis, that this description of language can operate across any language and any period of time, that there's always going to be a sound image that evokes a concept, and that that sign will refer to Lucy or some thing, some cat, some thing in the world. This is his way of showing in a synchronic way. Remember, diachronic would be across time. Synchronic is the structure. His showing in a structuralist way that language signs look like this and point to the world. They actually touch the world in this way by pointing to reference. Okay. In order to show that this is a structural, not specific to one signifier, one signified, one sign for that matter issue, he talks about how, see, my ability to draw cats really deteriorated over the course of the evening, I guess. So here we have three signs. In English, we say cat, C-A-T, and we think of this. In French, you say chat, C-H-A-T, and you think of this, which is supposed to be sort of the same as this. And then in Spanish, I hear you say gato. I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's how it's spelled. And you think of the same thing. So all of these signs work the same way, even though the sound images are different. The concepts are the same. The signifiers are different. The signifieds are the same. He's going to go on to say that the signifiers are arbitrary. You could say cat, you can say chat, you can say gato. It doesn't matter what you say, as long as there's a convention where a lot of people have agreed that whatever the sound image is going to evoke the concept of here, cat. Okay. Arbitrary and conventional. Arbitrary meaning it can be any of these letters. Conventional meaning we just have to agree on what the letters are and what the sound image is going to be. He also says, and this is more difficult to understand, and we'll spend more time talking about this in class, that the signified or the concept is arbitrary as well. So this isn't a particularly brilliant example, but say, I know what a cat is in English. I know the sort of range of things it applies to. I know what a chat is in French, and I know the range of things it applies to. But for example, in French, you can have, this is masculine, you could have a feminine chat, and that has two meanings. It means a female cat, and it also means women's private areas. And so that concept, that signified, would have two things in it that the sign in English doesn't. I have no idea about Spanish. I'm using it just because other people might know Spanish, so it seemed like a good enough language to pick. I should know Spanish. Gato, I do know is masculine, so this suggests a masculine cat probably, which is a slightly different concept than the English cat, because we don't have masculine and feminine. So Sure's going to say that the concept, the signified, is arbitrary also, in that we just decide that cats are masculine and feminine. And this is interesting also, although anecdotal, but mostly generationally. So like most people who are younger will say that all cats are chat. And no cats are feminine, independent of the gender of the cat, because they don't want to sound like they're using it in the slangy way. I have no idea what Spanish speakers do, but in French now, the sound image, the signifier, doesn't necessarily, the sign doesn't necessarily refer to an actual cat the way we might imagine that it did, and the way it did do maybe 40 years ago. So the concept is actually changing. The signified is actually changing. We'll talk about better examples in class, but essentially, it's important to note that not only are these arbitrary, which is just a way of saying I can pick any combination of letters and make them mean cat, but that the idea we have of cat in different languages is sort of different also. Cat in English can mean a big cat, like part of the cat family. I don't know whether that's true in French or Spanish. It might be true, but if it's not, that would be another example of how the signified is different in different languages. And so Sura would say that's an arbitrary difference. It doesn't have to be true. We've just decided it's true. It's arbitrary, and just conventionally, we've just agreed to make it work like that. This is kind of radical because it means that language doesn't have to work the way it does. It works in this way that's referential. It does describe the world, but it also works in a way that's arbitrary just by coming up with conventions. Okay, so this is something we're going to talk a lot about on, I guess, Friday. This is the thing that you have to understand on Friday in the reading for structuralism. There are a lot more examples that we'll go through in class. This, I know, is already really long. If this doesn't make sense to you, you need to ask me in class so I can explain it, or even send me messages now asking me questions about it. Next week, we're going to show ways in which we're going to talk about ways in which this maybe fails. And if you don't understand how beautifully it works, it will be a little harder to understand what happens when it starts to slip a little bit. And all of the rest of the term is about the kind of slippage that can occur in this diagram. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now, but send me questions. I just said this. Send me questions now if this actual image doesn't make sense to you, or send me questions or save questions for Friday's class so that you can ask me before we read the Saussure itself, which makes it sound, and the essay is a little bit more difficult than the way I've presented it here. Okay, I know this is long. Thank you for bearing with me.